Hey, it's Jason Jensen here with Chiro Cat, and today I just wanted to create a video to kind of walk you through how to set up this data importer project. That so this is intended for kind of new programmers to kind of get acquainted with the Chiro Cat way of doing things, and right off the bat, I just wanted to show you this data importer. This is a just a repository stored within Bitbucket, and I'm going to go ahead and set this up on screen. It's going to be pretty informal. This is not rehearsed, and so I'm just going to go through, and hopefully this can be a good just a reference for you, so that as you're setting up your own repository and you're kind of playing with the database fields, you can at least start, and hit the ground running. And of course, if you have any questions, reach out. But hopefully, this can give you a good, first steps. And you can go back and watch this over and over again, and we can give this to anybody else that we hire within Chiro Cat. So first things first. So this data importer, this is kind of it's just a brand new repository that I created, just to get your feet wet with how Chiro Cat stores its data. This is not at all what the Chiro Cat application is. This is just for importing data. Once we kind of get things up and running with new developers, we will be doling out permissions as needed, so that we can give more and more access to the code and to other things to help manage and run Chiro Cat. But for now, this is just a package, that is just intended for importing data. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clone this. I'm going to clone it in source tree. Let's see. And I'm just going to show this. I'm going to actually change it to Chiro Importer 2, just to kind of show you. So this is going to clone everything. I included the .env file with some credentials by default, just because it has credentials to log into our Wasabi instance. Now, Wasabi is very, very similar to Amazon's S3 service, and that's where we store most of our stuff for the production Chiro Cat. But for just the importer stuff, and just to get your feet wet, and so just to kind of segment things so you don't screw anything up if you are playing with this, we set up a completely separate Wasabi instance. And so I've just cloned this. I'm going to go ahead and open it up within. I use Sublime. I know a lot of people use different things, but I'm going to move this over to my other screen so you can see it. So this is the repository. Of course, the first thing that we want to do is open up a terminal, and let me close this one. Let's go ahead and we can do composer install. This will install all of the dependencies required in order to run some of the sample importing programs that I've created for you as a reference. So as soon as this is done, I can walk you through a little bit of what this does. And as I mentioned, this repository doesn't really do much. All of the views, it's just the default Laravel stuff. The stuff that you're going to be wanting to pay attention to, first of all, is in the database. I just created a SQL file. That is something I'm going to actually. So this is me setting this up to begin with. I'm going to go ahead and add a new database, and we're going to I'm going to do UTF-8 MB4. That's what Chiro Cat defaults to. And by the way, our MySQL instance on production is MySQL 8, whatever the current version is, 8 point what, but it's 8. Just this is on my local machine, so we're gonna name this data importer 2. Okay, and then we are going to import. Is this? Let's go to here and database SQL. So what this is doing, I'm restoring just the table structure. Now this table structure is also very much scaled down. Our actual production server, our production database has a lot more tables. However, a lot of those tables are unique just to Chiro Cat, and so we don't really care about them when we are importing data from external data sources or our competitors, really. We're pretty much the only service that helps chiropractors import their old data. And it's kind of an inexact science. There's no instruction manual on how to do this. And so a lot of what we do is kind of picking things little by little and trying to make sense of a lot of the data that we're seeing. So, boy, that's taking its sweet time, isn't it? I didn't realize. It's because I ran a few data imports before. So apologies for the large SQL file, but hopefully it will shed some more light on the actual database. So it looks like, we have our Composer install completed. We can probably close this now. And as soon as the database is ready, I will show you. Oh, let's do one other thing. I'm going to kind of show you the Wasabi instance. Give me just a minute to pull it over from my other screen. Okay. So here we go. The way that things work within Chiro Cat, and this is true of the S3, the AWS S3 instance for real production. This is just, again, a scaled down version that we store on Wasabi, which is virtually the same kind of thing. But every chiropractic office gets their own S3 bucket. And that's what these are. And this is the naming convention for them. Then what we do is within the S3 bucket, eventually as this location uses this, they'll have other folders for their patient data, for their I don't know, there's a bunch of other things, but for now it's just exports. This is the data that we receive from them, or we help them to export it so that we can then import it into Chiro Cat. And so we name it exports, and then in phase, this is the name of our competitor, or whatever data source we're importing stuff from. And then for every time that we export their data, we create a new date, and always in the year dash month dash day. Always have the leading zeros in here. It should be like a database date, really. And the reason why we do this is because oftentimes, from the time that we actually talk to them for the first time, and they're like, yeah, let's do this, to the time they actually go live, by then we've actually probably exported their data, 3 or 4 times, just to get a fresh install of their data, because sometimes we have to kind of show them the progress that we're making, and then we ask them, hey, does this data look right? And they ask us to make some tweaks to the import process, or something doesn't look quite right, and so we have to change something. But every time, it helps to have some fresh data. So that's why we put the data exports in their own date format. Right now, there's only one date here. And within here, this is where we actually store the actual data. In this case, because it's in phase uses a power.mdb file. And you can see it's 196 megs. But that's kind of the structure for how we store things. This is location 9829. And again, this is exports. So they're using a product called Chiro. That's where they're coming to us from. And so in order to export that data, they use another .mdb file. Yeah, so that's kind of how things work. Now we get data from all sorts of things. Sometimes we have it pretty easy, like an MDB file, or sometimes we get Microsoft SQL Server data, or sometimes we'll get just standard CSV. Sometimes we'll get what is it called, XML, and so it just depends on what they're coming to us from. In this case, it's Chiro, but different competitors of ours store the data differently, and we have to make sense of it all. So that's just kind of an overview of how we store things on Wasabi. Looks like we're done importing all the data for the data importer. So, excuse me. As I mentioned, this is kind of a scaled down version. Doesn't have all of the tables, but this is good enough to get started. And I'm just going to be walking through each of these tables to kind of give you an overview of what the purpose of each table is. Okay, so the first thing we'll start with is categories. And I should mention this. We do a lot of denormalization within our database. Now, so that what I'm trying to tell you is don't make fun of me too much. I know how to normalize a database so that you don't have the repeat data. However, sometimes in order to speed up queries and to make things easier for coding, we have a little bit of duplicate data. For example, almost all of these tables will have a location ID, even though that location ID can be inferred from some other ID that references another ID that references the location. Almost all of these tables will have a location ID. And that location refers to the chiropractic practice, and so if a chiropractor actually owns two practices, they would have two locations, and hence two location IDs associated with them. So getting back to the categories table, what this is it's just a way to, it's pretty self-explanatory, parent-child relationship. This is a self-referencing column where the parent ID references the ID column of the parent. And so another thing that we have is this thing called extra attributes. This is actually a JSON column that allows us to store anything that doesn't quite fit in to these columns. And like every Laravel installation, we have created that and updated that. That should be pretty familiar to you. But yeah, and the only thing that really uses the categories at this point is what we call templates. As a chiropractor is filling out chart notes, they don't want to retype everything every time. Saying, Jason complains of lower back pain, and this is what I did for him today. They want to have a pre-made template, or like a canned response, and they want to be able to store those templates in categories, and that's currently all that we use categories for. However, in the future, I can see us using categories for whatever needs to be categorized. That could be for templates, or for users, or for patients, or for anything that needs to be used. And so that's why we have, this can be used. It's pretty extensible, this categories table. We're going to skip down to the claims first. Claims, these are intended for insurance companies, this claims table. And what this is referencing to is within the medical community, there's something called a CMS 1500 form. I'll even Google it for you, 1500. And what this is it's a form that in order to get reimbursed via insurance, you have to fill out this kind of a form for medical reimbursement purposes. It's really stupid. Everybody in the industry kind of hates it, but it's the standard. And so you'll notice that our claims table follows pretty closely, box 1 and then box 2 and box 3. It follows pretty closely, like the patient's address and whatnot. And I was mentioning before, we have a little bit of redundant data in here. So the location ID that references the locations table. And by the way, I tried to make it so that in the relations thing, these relationships should be pretty strictly enforced. I'm hoping that's the case over time. But the entity ID that references, sometimes a chiropractic office might have multiple business entities. For example, you might have the actual chiropractor that does, cracks your back and does other kind of medical related things. You might have a completely separate business that does massage, and then a completely separate person that handles like nutrition, and all within the same office. And so those will all have the same location ID. However, they can have multiple entities. Now, most of the time, the entity ID and the location ID will, one location will most often have one entity. However, sometimes there are multiple entities. The contact ID, what this references, we don't actually call patients, we call them contacts. So the contacts is essentially the patient. User ID, this references really the person performing the action or the person who wants to be reimbursed by insurance companies, the provider, be it the chiropractor or the massage therapist. That's what the user ID is. Payer ID, this is something in the medical community. You'll hear insurance companies being referenced as the payer often. And so payer ID and, payer and insurance company and carrier, those are all kind of synonymous for the insurance company. A clearinghouse, what this is, think of, kind of how you have like a credit card merchant processor. Any company who wants to run credit cards for their customers will have a business that they hire to run the credit cards. And so an example of this might be Stripe. I like Stripe a lot. I love their API, but that's how people can bill credit cards. And then what happens is that Stripe is the one that then bills Visa or MasterCard or American Express. And they handle all the complexity for that. Another example of credit card merchant provider might be like Authorize.net. They do a lot of credit card processing, and they, all you do is send an API request to Authorize.net, and then Authorize sends it to Visa or MasterCard. It's very similar in the insurance industry, where you have a clearinghouse. And what clearinghouses do is they're the ones that you kind of send a request to the clearinghouse, and they act sort of like Stripe or Authorize.net. They're the ones who actually bill the insurance companies. Chiro Cat has no interest in billing insurance companies directly at this point, because what a nightmare. Every insurance company has different rules that you have to adhere to. They all have different ways of tracking things, different deductibles, different copays, it's just, and different formats for submitting claims to them. It's just a nightmare. And so most medical providers will use a clearinghouse in order to process their claims with insurance companies. And then that clearinghouse then charges a percentage of the claim. Again, very similar to how you process credit cards, where you might pay 2 point something percent to process credit cards. It's the same kind of deal where you might pay something like that for processing claims with like Select Health or Blue Cross Blue Shield. Those are insurance companies that we don't want to deal directly with. I think the clearinghouse earns their percentage because they simplify things for us. Chiro Cat is partnered with a company called Change Healthcare. Right there, Change Healthcare. That's our preferred clearinghouse. That's the one we support. If chiropractors want to process credit card or process claims electronically and very, very simply, they have to use Change Healthcare. So anyway, that's what a clearinghouse is. The rest of this stuff kind of coincides with the fields within this CMS 1500 form. So now that we have the claims taken squared away, let me show you the claim diagnoses and the claim treatments. Claim diagnoses references box 21 here, and this is all this is when you have like lower back pain, that's given a standardized number called an ICD-10 code. In the past, there used to be ICD-8 and then ICD-9. We're on version 10 now, and one day there will be ICD-11, but currently it's ICD-10. And the ICD-10 code is what we store here. This is kind of telling the claim what's wrong with the person. Okay. Then and you can see that, again, we reference the location ID and the contact ID and the claim ID. Even though the claim ID, we can infer the location and the contact simply through the claim ID. We can, reference the claim, and then from the claim, we can reference the location ID. However, again, for querying purposes, I think it's easier to just put these IDs in here so that we can query these very quickly. Even though I know it's redundant data, I think it's better. Also, same thing here. You might notice that we have like a contact ID which references like the patient, but we also record the patient address and city and state and phone. This is all redundant data. If we go into the contacts table, we can see a lot of this, address, city, state, zip. It exists here too. The reason why we don't just put a foreign key reference here is because we want historical data. Sometimes the contact information will change. We don't want that change to be reflected in the claims. And so because of that, we record every time for every claim the unique patient, city, everything. Even though a lot of this information can be found in the tables elsewhere, in order to collect the historical data, we don't collect just the contact ID. We collect also this information as well, so that once a claim form is created, it stays that way, even if you update the patient's information, because this CMS form is historical data. We don't want that to change if any information in the future changes. So I hope that makes sense. If not, please let me know. This is an important thing to get right. The fact that we store historical data. And even though I know it's redundant, and even though we're going to have, one patient will most likely have the exact same data stored in here for every claim they submit, there is the chance that it could change. And because of that, we want to store this, even though it's repetitive. Let's go to claim treatments. What this is talking about is this part, box 24 on the CMS 1500 form. And similar to the ICD-10 codes, these diagnosis codes, tell you what's wrong with the patient. These procedure codes, otherwise known as CPT codes, coding procedural treatment. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's CPT codes. This is what the chiropractor or medical provider did to fix what's wrong with the patient. And so again, diagnosis codes. This you might see a code like 98267, and that might be referencing back pain. I'm making this up, by the way. But then, in order to treat that lower back pain, a chiropractor will provide, an adjustment and then massage, and those adjustment and massages each have their own billing CPT code, and that's where we charge. That's where we keep record of all of that. Then next table is contacts. Again, every contact belongs to a location. Like I mentioned before, every one of these tables will probably have a location ID built into it. User ID, this is typically the name of the provider that this contact typically sees. Payer ID, again, this is referencing the insurance company for this particular contact. Father ID, if you kind of come in here, it can give you a good idea. This is just, it references the contacts table. This is if this contact has a father or a mother or a spouse. Default card ID, this is if this particular contact has signed up, has used a credit card in the past. Sometimes we store a tokenized version of their credit card information, and we just store it in the database. Anyway, hopefully everything else kind of makes sense. I tried to name things so that there's no ambiguity. And by the way, naming conventions, we do not abbreviate typically. It's okay to write it out. Even though I know it's longer, I think it's better coding when there's no ambiguity. So anyway, this diagnoses, this is a table that stores what's wrong with the contacts. In many ways, the diagnoses and the claim diagnoses are going to be similar. The claim diagnoses gets populated from this diagnosis table. And again, this might be a time when there's even more redundant data because you'll have a contact with 5 different diagnoses, and in order to fill out a claim, we will essentially just copy a lot of the diagnoses for that contact into the claim diagnoses. But those diagnoses can change over time, which is why we have repetitive data. The entities, this is, kind of comes back to what I mentioned earlier about one location can have multiple business entities. For example, a massage therapist or a nutritionist. This is an optional table for most businesses. Event types, what this is, when we have a calendar. Let me go to the calendar first, okay? And inside the calendar, we have, the option to have, who the provider is, the location, who the patient is. If this is a recurring event, sometimes, if you want to schedule somebody for 6 weeks, twice a week for 6 weeks, you can create a recurring event. If you had to reschedule the event, what's the new event ID? Room, hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. Purchase package visit ID. What this is sometimes patients will prepay for a package, which might entail like 10 visits for, such and such price. And so if that's the case, we want to mark, we want to allocate this particular visit to a package. And that's how we do it. So everything else hopefully should be pretty self-explanatory. We have a bunch of dates. Really the most important dates are start at and end at. Everything else kind of gets populated in automatically as the people use this program. The unavailable at and available at, that helps with scheduling. Sometimes a doctor might say, hey, I want to schedule a half hour in between each appointment. So even though an appointment is at 10, we're going to mark this as unavailable at 9:30. That's just an example. So then going to the event types. So this is important because this allows a doctor or the front desk person to specify some of their most common types of reasons for people to come in. For example, the new patient exam might take an hour and a half, and they want to color code it with yellow. And it's typically assigned to a particular provider within the office. And one location might have like 3 different chiropractors, but only one of those chiropractors sees new patients. And so this allows the users of the location to specify what types of events they can specify, kind of pre-populate it with. So, and another example of an event type might be, just a regular adjustment that takes like 20 minutes. And so, but they want to color code those with orange. And so this allows them to specify what event types there are, and it allows them to very quickly specify what, as they're creating an event, how they, the duration, how they want it to look, with whom is the patient going to meet, etc. We kind of covered ICDs. This is just a list of what happens is chiropractors kind of have a list of ICD codes that they use over and over again. Some chiropractors have like a list of like hundreds. Most chiropractors will have a list of like 20 ICD codes that they just use over and over and over again. But they are allowed to specify which ICD codes they want to use. And as I mentioned before, this is like a national standard. They have to use these particular codes, but chiropractors only have to use about 20 of them. So there isn't really a huge reason why they would have a bunch more, but we allow them to customize their ICD codes with the descriptions and whatever. Just as long as the code is accurate, they can put whatever they want for title and description so they can search it quickly. So location user, what this does is it allows one user to be able to toggle between different locations. A use case for this might be one doctor works at XYZ clinic on Mondays and Tuesdays, but then ABC clinic on Fridays. And so it allows them to be assigned to multiple locations. And this is pretty standard, many-to-many relationship. One thing that's important, though, is we have permissions built in to this joining table. And, I know that there's a lot of permissions packages out there, and Laravel supports permissions. This is a faster way to do it for us, and it just helps with simplicity. So you don't have to pay attention to this very much, but just be aware of that. Again, locations. A lot of this data, when we import data into Chiro Cat, the location information will be populated automatically. We grab that from Google most of the time. We just query Google Places and grab as much of this information as we possibly can. And so when we kind of turn over the data to a programmer to try and figure out how to import their data, this a location record will already be filled out. And so you can see here, this is a pretty typical filled out information for 9760, which is Back on Track Chiropractic. And anyway, this is how, this is what you start with, is this record. And so you can know the ID, and then you can go in and double check in here that the data is in there. 9760. You can see that, yes, we did export their data. It's in there. And so you don't have to mess with this a whole lot. And I'll just leave it at that. Migrations, that's just a Laravel thing. Model has permissions. Don't mess with these too much. This is just mostly for internal Chiro Cat users. That's what we use these permissions primarily for. Notes. What this is, these are chiropractic charting notes. And so, otherwise known as a SOAP note. Now, a SOAP note, what that means is it's broken out into subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. These other ones are not really used. These are kind of legacy now. So complaint and status and diagnosis, those are obsolete now. And eventually they will be deleted. But not yet. And so this is really important because a chiropractor is required to fill out a SOAP note or a medical charting note every time they see a patient. And so this is kind of the bulk of the information that we are trying to import. This is the historical data of a patient's healing process. And so when people, the biggest thing that we're going to be importing is contact information for the patients, which will go in here, and then note information for the medical charting notes. So this is a really important one. Hopefully it makes most sense. Options, this is a legacy thing. We don't really use it a whole lot, so you can ignore that. I mentioned packages, okay, where a patient can prepay for a number of visits or a number of procedures or a number of, there's different types of package. This one you shouldn't have to play with too much. This is one that we can come back to. I'll just leave it at that. Anything that has to do with packages, it can get a little complicated, so maybe leave it alone. Palpations. What this is it allows the doctor to specify a region of the body and specify what's wrong with it. So, for example, if the spine is segmented into different sections, such as lumbar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A chiropractor will come in and specify L1. It has 5 out of 5 on pain, and its hypertonicity is 3. And then they can write whatever notes they want. Palpations, typically we will not import this. However, some chiropractic programs outside of Chiro Cat will record this. If they have it, we can try and import it. Most of our competitors do not collect this information, so you can most of the time ignore this table. Password resets, we don't really care about that one. That's just a standard Laravel thing. Payers, this is an important one that we can import their external data for. This is the insurance companies. We just need to assign a Chiro Cat ID to a payer, and then we can assign all the rest of the claims to the newly created Chiro Cat ID. One thing I should mention though, most of these tables you'll see have what's called a reference ID. And what that is it's just a place for you to put whatever ID you want to for reference. It's made for us. Historically, what I have done is I've put the ID of the old database that we pulled stuff from. So for example, if somebody's using ChiroSoft, and we are importing contacts, and we're importing patient 200 from ChiroSoft, but then within ChiroCat, it becomes patient 28765. That's the new ID that we assign to it. We can still record the old patient ID, and that is coming really handy, because then what we can do is we can say, okay, anytime that we see this old patient ID in any of these other records that we're trying to import, for example, notes, We can go in and say, we're trying to import notes for patient 600 from ChiroSoft. We can say, okay, go and find the contact that is location 2 and reference ID of whatever I just said. Sorry, I have a terrible memory. Patient 800. And get this ID and then assign this ID to this new note that we are importing, all the while putting it in there. But then this note, this reference ID might be the old note ID from the old database that we're trying to import from. So just reference IDs are really valuable. They allow us to store historic, like past data IDs, which is why they're a varchar and not like a foreign key reference. Another thing that I should mention, historically what we've done also is for more complicated importing, what we've done just so that we can go back and fix any issues that might creep up like months down the road. We also store the entire record from the old database in this extra attributes thing. And so, for example, if the old database has like, first name, last name, address, we store all of that as JSON data in here under extra attributes. And we just say, ChiroSoft, we create the object ChiroSoft, and then we add the object of the the previous data. So that's one thing that we've done that's come in pretty handy multiple times. So let's keep doing that. Permissions, we're not going to worry about that. Policies. This is, if a contact or a patient has multiple insurance policies, this allows us to store insurance policies. This is pretty much just a, look up all the information we need and put it in there. Products. What this is, chiropractors often will sell, supplements or other things, like a exercise ball. This allows them to store products and the pricing information. Then down to purchased packages. Remember I mentioned with this, we should just talk through it if you have to import packages stuff. Reminders, we're not going to worry about this too much, but this allows, it's kind of like a to-do list. You can, within Chiro Cat, you can specify a due date, and what happens is on that due date and time, it will pop up some information of, whatever you want to remind yourself of. And you can actually assign different users to be able to see that reminder, or you can attach it to a different contact or a patient ID. It's pretty slick, but you probably won't be importing reminders a whole lot. These we can just, don't worry about those too much, because that's a internal Chiro Cat thing. Rooms, this is probably self-explanatory. Just chiropractor offices have multiple rooms. If they want to use this feature, we just try and import the rooms if we can collect the data from an external data source. Service fees and service groups. I want you, these three tables, just ignore for now. This is kind of a newer feature that we're working on, where we can have multiple contracted pricing per insurance carrier. And so, for example, Blue Cross Blue Shield might pay $40 for an adjustment, but Select Health might only pay $20. But the chiropractor agrees to that because they have a contract, and supposedly because they're in network, they get more business. So they're willing to go and do it for a lower price. And so this is, just ignore these for now, unless the chiropractor has specifically asked us to import their fee schedules. That's what these things are really for, is different pricing for different payers. The thing that you'll be most interested in is the services. This is the services is similar to the ICD codes. This is just kind of a table that kind of details out what the chiropractor can do. It's just kind of think of it as like a products table for services, and this is where we put the CPT code, and this is just kind of like it's a drop down, really. It's all the options that the chiropractor could do to you. Let's ignore shortcuts for now. Super bill transactions. Okay, so another thing that chiropractors do is sometimes they generate something called a super bill, which is very similar to a CMS 1500. It has a lot of the same information. However, it's not as formal, and there's no set way of including what information is required on a super bill. It's just kind of think of it as like a receipt. And the reason why super bills have a place in the chiropractic community is because sometimes a patient, or sorry, let me back up. A chiropractor doesn't want to bill the insurance company for a patient, but the chiropractor will give the patient a super bill, and then the patient can go to their insurance company and say, hey, I have this bill from my chiropractor. Can you please pay it? And in this case, it's the patient who goes to the insurance company rather than the chiropractor. That's kind of the use case for a super bill. And similar to the claims, we just include the transactions that might be associated with a super bill. Taggables and tags. This is just a taggable system from. It's just a package for Laravel. Sometimes when we import data, we find patients that are tagged as, like cash only patients or insurance patients or personal injury. PI is a big one that we deal with. And so personal injury, that just means where they got in a car accident. And so they're not actually using their own insurance to pay for the chiropractic visits. It's the person who's at fault in the accident whose insurance is going to pay for the PI. And so tags are often used to kind of designate what type of a patient they are. Any other kind of tags that we can allocate, any other data that we can find in the exported stuff, that's a good place to maybe put in the tag. Templates, this is what I mentioned earlier, where a chiropractor wants to create their charting note or their SOAP note very quickly. A template might be a way that it has like some predefined text for a specific procedure, and then the chiropractor can just point and click to get a whole paragraph's worth of chart notes. Tracking URLs, you don't have to pay attention to this. What happens for this is whenever we send out a text message or an email, we replace all of the URLs with a tracking URL that points back to Chiro Cat. We indicate whether it was clicked or not, and then we redirect them to the intended URL. So that's all that is. Transactions, this is another big one that we try to import data for. This is where we specify anything that affects a patient's balance or their ledger should go in the transactions table. And this can be a little complicated. Essentially, we have pretty much just an in and out ledger. We don't really allocate. Sometimes you have like several services that are performed, and then you have payments for those services. Some other chiropractic software things will allocate a specific payment to a debit within the transactions table. And so they allocate it only for that particular charge on the ledger. We don't do that. We just have pretty much hey, this was charged to the account, this was debited to the account, this was credited to the account. It's pretty much like a bank statement where you have a bunch of debits and credits, and at the very end, we just show the overall balance at the end, and that's how much they owe. So, one thing that we do is essentially anything that's a negative. Think of a negative as, hey, money, service was rendered or money going out. Positives are money coming in, or a write-off or a credit. So negative is debit, positive is credit. And everything else, hopefully, this can get a little complicated, but hopefully over time you can make sense of this. And as I mentioned, do you remember how I mentioned earlier about in the extra attributes column, we just put in phase with the date, the table, and then the object. This is all the old data that we imported for this particular record. Just so that if there's ever a question about some previous data that we didn't collect, we can always go back and say, okay, this Chiro Cat record came from this record. This is the original data. Did we miss something? Oh yeah, I see that we have a negative one there. Let's fix this. So anyway, that's just an example. Treatments. What this is when a chiropractor is performing a service for a patient, it is called a treatment. So remember, the service is the list of available things that a chiropractor can do. Treatments is the historical data of what actually was done on a particular day. And so you can see that, on we don't have any treatments here right now, but on I don't know. I guess we don't have a date. It's because we attach all treatments to a note, into a note. And so the note is the one that collects the date, and then we attach all treatments on that particular date. Let's see that we adjusted their back, and then we give them a massage. So there's 2 treatments. And so there will be 2 entries into here. Users, this is essentially everybody who will use Chiro Cat. And what we do is we have a one person has one login policy. So, we're not the police. If a chiropractor really wants to share his or her login information with his entire staff, they're welcome to do that. However, we feel like it's a lot better of a security standpoint for every single person to have their own unique user account. That way we can log and keep track of everything that happens. And we do audit every single change to the database, so that if anything happens, we can always go back and reconstruct what happened and who did what. But this is, when you're importing data, this will be important because a lot of the chart notes or the transactions or whatnot will be assigned to a particular user. And so it's important to bring in the users as we're importing data as well. Vendors, all this is just a table that shows who a particular product is from. And so vendors is just a lookup table essentially. So there you go. Sorry for the long-windedness. I just thought it would be good to kind of go over the important database aspects of things. Real quick, just to wrap things up, I wanted to show you how we import data, and then I'll end this video. So we do everything via the command line, and you can see that we have commands and then imports, and we'll do in phase first. Okay, the way that we do things is we have just one import command, where we do PHP artisan import and then the location ID. And what this does then is it comes through, because it can be pretty intense with processing things, we bump up the memory limit a lot because we're dealing with gigabytes of information. And I should also mention, sometimes we need to deal with information, and there's a way to what's the right word? To increase the efficiency of a particular query. However, because we're not going to be importing data for a particular location often. Hopefully we do it, maybe like once to kind of show them, hey, here's what your data looks like. Does it look good? Oh, we need to make a few tweaks. We'll re-import it with those few tweaks, and then, okay, you're good to go. So it's not like we're going to be running this on production all the time. And so that's important to realize, because I favor, at least with the import process, I favor simplicity and readability over efficiency. Everything else in the application, I want it to be zippy and fast. However, with the import stuff, because it can get kind of complicated, I think it's important to be able to make sense of the code. And so it's important to just have it be readable. Yeah, that's all. Anyway, so going down here, what this import command does is it then calls these what we call sub commands. And the reason why we split it out this way is because it's just segments, different types of importing of data. And if there's ever a problem, we can isolate it to a particular type of data import. It also matters the order of this stuff. So, for example, we don't really want to import events, like appointments or transaction data, until we have the contacts imported, so that we can use the Chiro Cat contact IDs rather than the old database's IDs. And because Chiro Cat is a multi-tenant database, all of our locations share the same database. And so our IDs are going to be a lot bigger usually than the data that we're importing. So, for example, a contact ID from Chirosoft might be 280. In Chiro Cat, it will be 3789260. That's we have a lot of contacts in our database. So anyway, so it's important that the order that we import things. Typically, what we do is we import all of like the lookup tables. These are things that are not really dependent on anything else. These are things that just exist. Anytime we have like a drop down, like ICDs or services or payers or vendors, we import those first, and then we import the stuff that links to these. So that's how we do it. We can run each one of these events individually. However, once we get the system down, I want it to be where we just run in phase import location ID, and then it runs all the rest of these. So just to show you, PHP artisan, I forget the location here, 9760. Hold on. So we'll do 9760. And so what's happening now is it's running the get DB from storage, this command. And what that does is it goes and grabs it from the S3 bucket. It grabs the data. In this case, it's db.mdb. And it's downloading it to a local, temporary storage folder, so that we can process it locally on the server. So you can see it's transferring. While it's doing this, let me show you one other thing. I did it. So, and it kind of shows you how long it took to do that one step. Now we're going to be going on to probably the import contacts, and see, yep, we're importing all these contacts. Anyway, that's kind of how we structure things. I would invite you to take a look at this code and try and emulate it as you're importing stuff from other databases. One thing that I made This is the base import command. And what this does is it allows us to kind of create a map of between the old database IDs where we use the reference ID and then the Chiro Cat assigned IDs. And so I would invite you to use this, often. And I use the base users and then the base users map often. There's different reasons why you might use one or the other, but hopefully this code will be more descriptive than I will be just by talking. So I think a good programmer will be able to just look at the code and then come to me with questions. So, but yeah, anytime you have like users or contacts, these are things that are going to be referenced often in other database tables, and we need to have the newly created Chiro Cat ID, and that's what this is for. So, and then of course we have the connection to S3, and then we have functions, that we can log stuff. And what this does, we actually keep a log of the import process and we store it in the location table. And so anytime that we have an issue, or we're moving on from importing contacts. Now we've done calendar stuff. Now we're going to be importing transactions. So anytime that something like that happens, we log it in the import notes, and that way we can see later what happened during an import process. So anyway, just play with this. Like I said, you will receive the information for the location, and then this is what you'll get. And then typically we have account managers that go out and get the data. They help the chiropractic offices get the data, and they're the ones that are responsible for uploading the data. And then your role will be to use that data and to maybe work with the account managers if there's some clarification that needs to happen. You will work with the account managers to clarify what the data means, or if there's any missing data. But typically you'll be given this, and then you will be given an S3 folder with some data in it. And then from there, you will be responsible for importing data into Chiro Cat and mapping it to the correct fields. Hopefully this isn't an overload. I know that this is drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, but hopefully this sheds some light on how Chiro Cat stores its data. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. My number is 801-707-2180. And my email is jj@chirocat.com. Hopefully this can make sense to you. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you later.